Well, good morning, everybody. Time to get started. Welcome to everyone who's watching us online in a slightly weird way. I can see my audience here, but not all of you out there in Zoom land, Teams land. Welcome to this breakfast briefing on onshore wind, which with characteristic wit we've called Back to the Future, obviously arising out of the recent policy announcement, bringing onshore wind back to life, which for reasons I'll come to, I'm personally very happy about indeed. What we're going to talk about this morning, I'm going to talk just a little bit initially about the evolution of policy and the context for the recent announcement. Claire Nevin, who is one of our juniors, actually not anymore, time passes, one of our middle-ranking juniors, will talk to us then about what current policy actually is. I will then come on to talk about what I've called the planning balance, which is really to look at how it's likely that issues of need and environmental impact will be weighed up in the new environment, and talk a little bit about how that contrasts with experience from years past, in the years before 2015 when the effective ban came in place. I did a lot of wind farm inquiries, enjoyed them very much. And they're very interesting, but we'll see how the lessons from those earlier inquiries might or might not still be applicable in the new environment. And then Claire is going to talk to us about the community benefits protocols, because as well as the purely planning aspects of the reintroduction of onshore wind, there's been a great deal of development of the notion of non-planning benefits, which, whilst not necessarily part of strictly the planning balance, are nevertheless very important in the determination of applications, or will be, for onshore wind. And then finally, I'm just going to sum up some thoughts about where things might go more generally. So that's how we're going to tackle this morning. The first thing to say really about wind energy and onshore wind is how much and how important it actually is already. The existence of the ban has rather obscured the fact that when onshore wind was allowed, quite a lot of it was developed, and it is a significant part of the energy mix already. Now, obviously, in recent years, the focus has all been on offshore wind, and it remains part of the government's intention to hugely increase offshore wind. But within the context of existing energy mix, onshore wind is really very important already. So just looking at these statistics, which are a little bit old now, but they're the best that I can find. In 2020, wind energy was already on occasions up to 40% of electrical generation capacity. And of that, 29% of it was onshore and 23% of it offshore. So although those figures will have changed slightly, and there's been a greater development of offshore wind in the recent period, nevertheless, one does see that onshore wind is still pretty important. And it's also worth noting the progress that was made from the early 2010s. There was a series of documents called the UK Renewable Roadmap, which I'll come on to talk a bit more about later. And that in July 2011 was looking for around 29 gigawatts of onshore wind in operation by 2020. And the actual figure was 48 and more gigawatts. So one can see there that there was a loss of development of onshore wind, and it was and is an important part of the energy mix already. The policy regime overall, the framework is set by the Climate Change Act 28 with its desire to move towards net zero. There's still an extant BEIS paper, the government department as it used to, Business Enterprise Initiative, whatever it was, now the Department of Energy effectively, which still regards onshore wind as a key component in the UK energy mix. And we look now exclusively at the moment towards the MPPF and the MPPG for policy for onshore wind schemes as part of the reaction against onshore wind from the Cameron government in 2016, the ability to take onshore wind schemes through the NSIP regime, through the Planning Act regime, was removed, even for the largest schemes. There weren't any really coming forward, but for the largest onshore schemes, the usual threshold of 50 megawatts generation capacity, which takes any energy scheme into the NSIP regime, that was taken away for onshore wind. So onshore wind at the moment, regardless of size, is dealt with exclusively through the MPPF and MPPG regimes. Now, the killer in 2015 was what was called the local opinion clause. This was introduced to the MPPF in a couple of footnotes, which were added to the passages on energy. The paragraph numbering has changed, as Claire will come on to when we look at current policy, but the policy wording was similar. And the only circumstances, according to this local opinion clause, in which you could get planning permission for onshore wind was if the wind farm was in an area which had been identified as suitable for wind energy in the development plan. So that's the first hurdle. There had to be an identification in each development plan of the suitable areas for wind. But then the killer really was the suggestion that, or the requirement, that following consultation, it can be demonstrated that the planning impacts identified by the affected local community have been fully addressed and the proposal has their backing. So that was effectively a suggestion that, and it was taken as such, that unless everybody in the local community agreed, if there wasn't any local opposition, those are the only circumstances in which you could get planning permission for onshore wind. Now, obviously, for any wind farm of any size at all, I mean, really anything other than the smallest, tiniest local turbine, there is always going to be public opposition. So this effectively acted as a ban. Now, there were arguments that were used, and this is a sort of historic slide almost, trying to think about how one might have got around it. The issue of whether or not there was local opposition was said to be a matter for the judgment of the local planning authority. So it might conceivably have been possible to persuade a local planning authority that there was universal community support for the scheme. The MPPG, interestingly enough, when it gave guidance on this, actually said slightly different wording from the MPPF policy, in that it said the planning impacts identified by the affected local community have been fully addressed, and therefore the proposal has their backing. The word therefore was introduced. Now, it might have been possible to argue that if you had fully addressed the planning effects, that word therefore meant, by definition, that the proposal had community backing, but that was a pretty weak argument, a pretty feeble argument for a developer to risk a multi-million-pound scheme on. So the effect was totally chilling, a deep freeze. In fact, it acted as an effective ban. And so, as matters stand, only about 11% of all local planning authorities in England have areas identified as being suitable for wind energy. In the 5 years after the ban came in, only 11 planning applications for new onshore wind turbines were approved. And of course, these were tiny little single schemes, nothing in the way of a commercial wind farm. Only 2 since 2020. And then just as a statistic to show just how extraordinary this is, that Ukraine, during the war, managed to build 118 wind turbines, whilst we in England built none. So one can see the effect that the policy had. The title of this next slide is only for those who are of an age to remember Top Gun. And you've got to say it with a Tom Cruise voice. Any of you boys seen an aircraft carrier around here? Well, any of you boys seen a wind farm around here? Well, I thought it was good. I mean, effectively what happened is that the notion of onshore wind, as well as the effective ban, it disappears from policy documents. Governments continuing to produce with tedious regularity documents about energy production and energy self-security. But onshore wind as a concept simply disappeared. We'll perhaps remember the white paper of 2020 and probably more memorably Boris Johnson in his pomp talking about how we were going to become the Saudi Arabia of wind. Might be a definition that applies to him, but anyway. But that was all through the means of offshore wind farms. Again, nothing onshore. And the more recent document called Powering Up Britain. One of those documents, you open it up and you see Grant Shapps' ugly mug as the Secretary of State, and you remember just how many documents of government have him as Secretary of State in differing departments. So it was like a bad dream. Anyway, the Powering Up Britain document did actually refer to some possible planning reform, but nothing more. Again, no indication of onshore wind being regarded by government as a contributor to the overall energy mix. There was a bit of pressure towards the end of the last Tory government for reform, and there was a written ministerial statement on the 5th of September 2023, which was trumpeted on the radio as the end of the ban on onshore wind, and it got me very excited when I heard on the radio till I actually read the thing. And there was effectively no real change. What happened was that the government said that you could identify the areas in which wind energy would be permitted in a different way. And there was a sort of exhortation to local planning authorities to say that the words of the local opinion clause didn't really mean what they said, and you could still grant wind farms, but nobody put any real credence on that. And then another quote, Harold Macmillan, the wind of change blowing over Africa, as he said it. It's the wind of change blowing over the UK and onshore wind policy. I had always thought in the run-up to the last election that planning reform would come through very quickly because the government would need to demonstrate, the new Labour government would need to demonstrate it was changing things and getting on with things, but they haven't got any money. So things that cost money were not going to happen, and therefore the things that didn't really cost money, such as planning reform, would come to the fore for political reasons. But I think even I was surprised at how quickly they moved, sort of 4 days after the election. There was a policy statement on onshore wind with a commitment to double onshore wind by 2030 and the removal of what were then footnotes 57 and 58, which were the requirement that wind farms could only be located in areas designated in local plans and the dreaded local opinion clause. They were removed. The NPPF was going to be repromulgated, and it was announced as a matter of policy effective immediately, that those two clauses had gone, and onshore wind was therefore going to be on the same footing as other energy projects in the NPPF. There in just a moment we'll come on to what the policy actually says. And the other matter that was flagged up was the suggestion that larger projects could come back within the NSIP regime, and that there would be a new national policy statement within the NSIP regime on onshore wind. So we will wait and see what comes of that, and I'll say a little more about that later. And all of this was effective immediately. So as of now, those blockers have gone. So that's where policy and how policy has evolved. I'm going to turn now to Claire, who's going to take us through what the NPPF actually tells us we should be doing.
Thank you, Andrew. So yes, the NPPF deals with this at paragraph 163, which sets out the national policy on renewable energy. The first aspect of paragraph 163 is essentially, it deals with the weight that you're to be attaching really to the need for renewable energy overall. And policy sets out very clearly that there is no need for applicants to demonstrate the overall need for renewable or low carbon energy. And that even small scale projects, of course, then provide a valuable contribution to significantly cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And we had preparing this talk, myself and Andrew had an interesting discussion about when Andrew was dealing with some of these applications back in the day. There used to be debates around the overall need and how far targets were being met. But policy is clearly setting out now that debate is somewhat said to be over in national policy. We've gone beyond debating the need for renewable energy. That should be taken as a given at this stage. And then moving on from that, then the second part of paragraph 163 that's important for our purposes is that local planning authorities should approve the application if its impacts can be made acceptable. And that's something that Andrew is going to deal with later in the presentation. And then finally, looking at questions of repurposing and extending the life of existing renewable energy, paragraph 163 says that LPA should give significant weight to the benefits of using established sites and approve if, again, the impacts can be made acceptable. So that's where policy currently stands with the removal of the footnotes that Andrew mentioned. Of course, the NPPF is somewhat of an iterative living instrument document at the moment and will be subject to further updates. But turning then to another part of the NPPF, which is material for the issue of onshore wind. Andrew touched on the fact about the fact you've got the separate NSIP regime, which of course you'll all be familiar with, and there are discussions to bring onshore wind back under that regime now. But the question of the extent to which NSIPs and the NPPF will be relevant to wind is somewhat captured in paragraph 5 of the NPPF. And so the NPPF paragraph 5, of course, recognises that the planning policy does not contain specific policies for NSIPs. That's a separate regime. However, national policy statements do form part of the overall framework for national planning policy. And so NPS may be a material consideration then when making decisions on planning applications. And so the NPS will come into play then as a material consideration potentially in the onshore wind applications. But again, that's something that Andrew will go into in more detail. So then finally, in terms of policy and where we currently stand, the NPPG is currently awaiting revision. So it is somewhat out of date on this question now, given the updates that Labour have just made with the policy statement. But it still importantly does contain a local opinion clause. So there are obligations there currently in the NPPG to still fully address the planning impacts on local communities. The NPPG sets out a range of effects that must be considered when with detailed guidance on how this will be assessed. And Andrew will go into that as well in a bit more detail. But then also currently in the NPPG, it states that there is a mandatory pre-application consultation requirement with the local community. And it explains that under the DMPO 2015, there is a legal requirement to conduct a pre-application consultation when there are more than 2 turbines proposed or the hub height of any turbine exceeds 15 metres. So that's where we currently stand on the policy. And I will move over to go back to Andrew now to talk about the balance.
Thank you. Yeah, the issues in terms of the planning balance to be drawn, this is really, I guess, the meat of where we can take some learning from the past, is the issue of the benefits, surprisingly enough, against the disbenefits. The benefits primarily of wind energy are the delivery of renewable energy. That's the key, obviously. There are a limited number of other benefits around economic benefits just from any scheme that it generates economic activity, albeit that's pretty limited because there's a period when the turbines are being constructed, and then once they're up, they just stand there making electricity with a little bit of maintenance and servicing. So the economic benefits aren't great. So it really is all about the renewable energy that's provided. And the contrast, of course, is the environmental impact. And we'll look at some of those in a bit of detail later. But obviously wind turbines are large structures which have certain other consequences attached to them. So how does one go about giving weight in that planning balance to the need for renewable energy? Before the ban came into effect in 2015, there was always an argument to be had at inquiry about exactly what weight should be given based upon this document called the UK Renewables Roadmap. Now that set specific targets for the provision of onshore wind. And I alluded to some of those earlier on, but it set out a particular target of gigawatts to be achieved. And one would look at, and I did most of my work opposing wind farm schemes, acting for local planning authorities. As an aside, at the same time, I used to do a lot of work promoting open cast coal sites. So I was top of Greenpeace's Christmas card list in terms of promoting coal and opposing wind, but hey, you've got to run across somehow. And the developers would always argue that there was an unlimited demand, an unlimited need for renewable energy. And we would always counter by saying, well, look at the renewables roadmap. Crucially, look at the pipeline of onshore wind that's coming. And the situation is okay, we would say. There's plenty coming. You don't really need this one. Or if you do need it, you don't need it so badly that all the horrible effects that it's going to have are outweighed. That was the way the argument was always put. And it quite often succeeded. There were other reasons, but it was always a buttress for any inspector who didn't like the particular landscape and visual impacts of the scheme. Now, I think it's quite unlikely that that type of argument is going to be available in the new rebirth of onshore wind. There aren't any specific targets in policy other than the expressed intention to double the amount of onshore wind by 2030. Now, if you think about that in terms of the timescale for construction, 6 years to 2030, that implies an enormous increase, an enormous provision of wind energy in really quite a short period of time. And it's going to be pretty difficult, I suspect, to argue that there isn't a need for this particular wind farm. Now, the NPPF, as Claire has said, says there is no need to demonstrate overall need, and that's true. But that was true even back in the day when one was arguing about the UK Renewables Roadmap. The original NPPF had similar wording about the lack of need to demonstrate need. But there was still this argument based on the targets in the roadmap. I say that's gone now. The other buttressing factor, I think, is the national policy statements on energy. As I said, onshore wind was removed from the NSIP regime completely in 2016. But there's still that provision, paragraph 5 of the NPPF, that the national policy statements may be material considerations. And when one delves into the MPSs themselves, EN1 for energy in particular, the recently reissued one, because it's been updated, last year it was promulgated, and that says very clearly that there is an urgent need for electricity generation schemes, and goes on to say that substantial weight should be afforded to that need, and that's going to be the basis upon which the Secretary of State makes decisions on NSIPs, namely there's an urgent need for the infrastructure and substantial weight is going to be given. Now, obviously, MPSs do not apply directly to planning applications, but because of this indication that they may be regarded as material considerations. That's likely to be prayed in aid by developers who will say, that statement applies to all energy projects irrespective of size. There's the backup in the NPPF that says that even small-scale schemes can make a contribution. So I think the likelihood is that there's going to be a great deal of weight attached to need in a way which is slightly different and more in favour of the grant of permission than was previously the case before the ban. Put into the balance against that are the adverse impacts. The guiding principle for the NPPF is that one should grant permission if the adverse impacts can be made acceptable. Now, that's a pretty flexible phrase, which is going to give inspectors plenty of scope to give effect to their own views. But it is it's quite a permissive regime, really, the use of the word acceptable. And I've had inspectors looking at the dictionary to see what the word acceptable means. And it clearly envisages that there will be some effects allowable. It's also the case that if one goes, again, back to the national policy statements, the NSIP statements on infrastructure, there's specific guidance in those that says, effectively, if you're getting a big contribution from an energy project, that you can accept a bigger impact, particularly in landscape and visual terms, than you might otherwise find acceptable because of the contribution that's being made. But nevertheless, landscape and visual impact in particular are the kernel of opposition to onshore wind, and they will clearly remain so. The MPPG, as Claire mentioned, provides some guidance for each of these environmental impacts. We'll look at some others in a moment. And what the MPPG says is that if the impact of the wind farm becomes significant or defining in the landscape or the visual environment, then that may be a basis for refusing permission. Similarly, if it becomes a feature in particular important views or in sequences of views, again, that may be a reason to refuse. Now, it's always the case that, I've always thought anyway, and apologies to any landscape architects who are watching, that the nature of landscape and visual impact assessment has always been to try and bring a degree of objectivity to an exercise which is essentially subjective. We all react differently to impacts on views and landscapes, and this is particularly so with wind farms. We talk about covalence as a pompous way of saying it's a bit of a Marmite thing. Some people love, are perfectly content with wind farms. Other people hate them in any circumstances. And there's always that tension at inquiry about how people react to wind farms. And although, again, there is the usual exhortation in the guidance to do landscape character-based assessments and visual impact assessments with photo montages and so forth, which one can do quite accurately. Nevertheless, there's often just a straightforward decision for the inspector as to whether or not she's prepared to accept that wind farm in that location. And that's often, I always had the sense, very much driven by whether they actually like the notion of wind farms in a landscape or not. Also, one has to consider cumulative impact. And I suspect with this enormous expansion of onshore wind that the government seems to be contemplating now, that cumulative impact assessment is going to be very important, both existing sites and proposed sites. So we'll see a good deal of that type of assessment. That's really the main issue I've always found with wind farms. There are other specific issues which one just needs to be aware of. Fall over distance, which is basically you have to envisage the wind turbine falling over and not hitting a building. And therefore you have to allow the height of the turbine plus the blade of its furthest extension plus 10%. That's the guidance, the fall over distance. And so that's a matter of proper design. It should never, no sensible wind farm developer is going to fall foul of that. There are issues with air safety and radar. These things can have quite an impact on radar systems. And certainly in the earlier iteration of wind farms, it was quite an issue for the Civil Aviation Authority, for whom I acted on quite a few wind farms. Proper real sort of little boy stuff, going up to see the control tower at Glasgow Prestwick Airport to see what a wind farm was going to do to their radar. That's why I love these inquiries so much. You've got that sort of thing. The systems are much more sophisticated now that they can patch in a little segment to sort of blank out the reflection from the turbines, so the turbines pick up radar waves as they're rotating. But again, these are important issues which will need to be considered again, and for which there isn't the body of knowledge that there perhaps used to be when this was being considered all the time, albeit that Scotland still provides plenty of examples that one can use. The impact on highways in terms of driver distraction and what's called shadow flicker. Shadow flicker effectively is where the rotation of the blades causes an intermittent sort of flashing, flickering shadow on the ground. Can be very, very distracting. And in this country, we've taken a pretty strict view of making sure that shadow flicker doesn't impact things. But again, that's something which with good design ought to be capable of being overcome. Ecology, this is a big issue in the minds of many, but actually in reality isn't an issue of great moment. It's actually something that Donald Trump goes on about a lot, actually. I think you'll notice whenever he talks about wind farms, he says they kill birds, which occasionally they do. I can remember one of the longest 2 minutes of my entire life was at a wind farm inquiry where one of the protest groups was showing a video of a bird of prey soaring in the vicinity of a turbine. And every time it went up and the blade came down, you thought, oh, it's going to hit it. And you knew at some point, because they wouldn't be showing the video otherwise, that it was going to happen. And we sat there for about 2 minutes of going around. Each time the blade came down, you thought, oh. And eventually it got splatted. So it does happen, but it's not a particularly large issue in reality in terms of the weight that's afforded to it. Generates a great deal more heat than light generally. Noise. This is an issue with wind farms, and it was an issue with which the industry was wrestling before the ban came into effect. Wind farms produce two types of noise, effectively. They produce a sort of constant noise as the blades rotate, but there's a particular phenomenon where every once in a while they produce an intermittent thumping sound, which is quite intrusive. And the issue of that intermittent thumping sound was never really sorted out by the industry in terms of how one could assess it. The guidance, ETU 97, which is the sort of standard guidance on wind farm noise to which decision makers were directed, doesn't really wrestle with this issue. And there was a lot of scientific research going on at the time to try and see how this noise issue could be determined. But we'll have to see where they get to once these issues come back. But noise is quite a big issue with wind farms. Also heritage, the importance of setting. This is, unfortunately, the slide wasn't unclear. You will see there and there a couple of wind turbines intruding above this heritage asset. Now, this is actually a historic heritage asset in Germany. You'll see there the tower there and the tower there in the lake. This is the Möhne Dam, which is one of the two dams which was destroyed by the RAF in the dam busters raid. And as a bit of a geek, I went to look at it some years back and I took this photo and I did notice that people were intruding into this historic view. And so I use that to illustrate my heritage points. I'm sure there are other more mundane heritage assets which one could have used, but I like that one. So there it is. But in reality, one has to remember, particularly given what's been said in the Barnwell Manor authorities and many others about the importance of setting. Obviously, wind turbines, large structures, they're in motion, potentially distracting, potentially having a major impact on setting. And again, this will be one of the bigger issues when wind farm development comes back. So where all this leaves us is that there are real issues which can be used to resist wind farm development, but we're in a situation where we have a wide range of facts, some of which are unique to wind farms, as I've talked about, which are going to require environmental assessment in a way that hasn't been done for a decade. And it's inevitable that the skill sets will have deteriorated, particularly at local planning authorities. So it's going to be a big issue, I suspect, in the next few years as to how local authorities can gear up again to assess what might be, a considerable volume of wind farm applications. When looking at these assessments, one has to remember the law on salami slicing. Wind farm applications are usually based upon an assessment of wind energy resource. It's amazing, actually. This is one of the things I learned doing inquiries, how incredibly commercially sensitive information about wind is, because the particular siting of a wind farm and the relationship between each of the individual turbines and the airflow around them is very, very complicated to maximize the energy yield. And most wind farm applications will begin with a separate application for a wind monitoring mast and a NOMITAP, get that phrase out. And again, we'll need to be careful about the grid connection issues, because this is the other aspect of salami slicing. Smaller scale wind farms, sort of a dozen turbines, something of that nature, the issues with grid connection may not be particularly significant. It's likely to be just a substation and then some wiring. But nevertheless, that can have a considerable, particularly visual impact. And we have to remember the law as it stands with respect to the different phases, in this case of oil extraction, the Europa oil and gas case, which told us that extraction and exploration were two separate things which needed to be assessed separately, or could be assessed separately. So again, it'll be an interesting thing to see how quickly the industry can gear up to do proper environmental assessments of the particularly unique features of wind farms, and in particular how local planning authorities are going to be able to respond. So that's the overview I have of the planning balance and some of the issues in determining applications. All to play for, I think, in terms of opposition to them, but equally, I think the need arguments are going to be stronger and be able to put more decisively in this iteration of wind farm policy than they were before the ban. The other aspect of these matters is community benefits, which is an emerging issue which wasn't really part of the regime before, as I recall. So we have a little to learn about that from Claire now. Thank you.
So I'm going to speak a little bit about community benefits now, and particularly community benefits protocols. And so as we've been discussing, we've seen that essentially local opposition, this de facto ban, which was introduced in 2015, has been removed from the policy. But that doesn't mean that local involvement, local buy-in, community participation is not going to be important going forward. It very much is. It's just going to be slightly different. And we've seen an indication of this in the new government's policy statement on onshore wind. This is the policy statement on the 8th of July, which removed the de facto ban. But this policy statement, it recognises that local communities will continue to play an essential role in delivering onshore wind. And it delivers a commitment to facilitating participation in decision making. It states very clearly that communities should benefit from hosting local renewable energy infrastructure. They should reap direct benefits from that. And the most interesting part of this, I think, is the commitment to updating the community benefits protocol for onshore wind in England. So I'm going to somewhat speculate on what that might look like and how we might see that community benefits protocol evolve. So currently, the current community benefits protocol is essentially some good practice guidance. It dates from December 2021. And the greater part of this guidance is essentially best practice in how to effectively undertake early community engagement in the decision-making process. And it sets out sort of the various steps that applicants should be taking to engage with the community, to get as many people on board as possible, even how to define the community. It's quite helpful on that broader community engagement aspect. And it states, of course, that when we're looking at community benefits, and Andrew has mentioned this, of course, it's important to recognise that the types of benefits now that I'm discussing are somewhat separate from those broader sort of still compliant issues that you would look at in the planning process and the planning balance. This is a somewhat separate aspect. It's not a material consideration in determining whether planning permission should be granted. That must, of course, be confined to what makes the development acceptable in planning terms. But we're going to see, I think, the issue of community benefits become more important and help to counter that local opposition sometimes that isn't going to go away. And it's going to be a way to try and get that community buy-in. So in terms of what kind of aspects we're going to see in the community benefit beyond that wider community participation, community benefit funds and local energy discount schemes or shared ownership, they're already mentioned in the current community benefits protocol. There's not an awful lot of detail on them in the current document, but it states things like community benefit funds, of course, being a fund established where it'll essentially be a money pot for the local community to dip into to finance projects of importance. That can be educational, it can be essentially anything that the local community might feel would be a benefit to them. And then local energy discount schemes and shared ownership are also mentioned in the current policy documents. So essentially, it is what it says there really. Things like reduced tariffs for electricity as well, getting some benefits through discounts, real kind of lived benefits that the community will feel from having the onshore wind located near them. I think one of the most interesting aspects that really caught my attention of where this might go is the question of shared ownership. So the community benefits protocol for England and onshore wind in England recognises, of course, that it is more common for wind farms to be owned by private developers and to be developed by them, the more commercial aspect of things. But it recognises that there are nonetheless opportunities for community or shared ownership. And the current protocol sets out 3 examples, the first being joint ventures. So joint ventures is essentially a model where the community and a renewable energy business will create an organisation to bring forward the project. That's one way this can be done. Another way is through shared revenue. So this would operate through a legally constituted community organisation that buys the rights to a future revenue stream. So it reap the benefits essentially of a specific portion of the output from the onshore wind. And then a final aspect of shared ownership or community ownership envisaged in the current protocol is split ownership. So a legally constituted community organisation which owns a proportion of the development's physical assets. So that's what's currently there. So looking at how the future, what the future might hold then for community benefits, and given that there is a commitment in the policy statement to update the protocol, the Labour manifesto has set out a commitment to deploying local energy production to benefit communities. There's a commitment there to ensuring that Great British Energy will partner with energy companies, local planning authorities and cooperatives to install renewable projects. The communities will be invited to come forward themselves with proposals for projects. And I've been looking at examples where there's perhaps a more elaborate, more developed approach to community benefits, shared ownership, some of these models we've been discussing. And the Scottish model I think is going to be something that's going to be looked at. This is sort of where I think speculating this community protocol might go. I think it will take inspiration from the Scottish model in terms of updating the current community benefits protocol for onshore wind in England. So, well, what does that Scottish model say? There's an onshore wind sector deal which was published in Scotland in September 2023 last year, and it adopts a community wealth building approach to economic development, and it explicitly commits onshore wind and renewable energy to integrating the principles of a just transition to a net zero economy, ensuring that communities feel the benefits of the energy transition directly themselves. It's just transition. And the policy statement there, it sets out the benefits that are expected for local communities. So it's quite a prescriptive approach. These are things that in the Scottish model are expected, and it is somewhat more prescriptive. So what kind of things are set out there? There's an encouragement of community shared ownership models and a commitment by the end of 2024 to create a national register of community benefit and community shared ownership that will be updated on an annual basis. So that's something that's coming through the pipeline in Scotland and something that could easily be replicated in England. So we might expect to see some things like that finding their way into the protocol. There's also in the Scottish model a community benefits toolkit, and this is something that's on the Local Energy Scotland website, and it updates relevant case studies on an ongoing basis to give inspiration essentially for what community benefit funds, what shared ownership might look like. So that's a readily accessible tool that can be used and easily translated across into England and the rest of the UK. Also moving away then from that more recent document, going back a little bit to December 2022, there's an onshore wind policy statement in Scotland that encourages developers to offer shared ownership opportunities to communities as a standard aspect of all new renewable energy projects. So that's a policy expectation on developers there. And there's quite a lot of assistance in Scotland to help local communities consider how they might approach the issue of shared ownership. Of course, these are legal entities and communities need assistance in terms of how that might look and what kind of proposals they might bring to developers. And so Scotland has a community and renewable energy scheme, and that's delivered by Local Energy Scotland on behalf of the Scottish Government. And CARES essentially provides funding and support to help communities identify their needs, and it provides advice and support for setting up community funds. So we might see something like that appearing in the updated protocol, a similar entity that's there, that has government support, that is providing funding and advice to communities about how they might set up these community funds. And when I was preparing this talk, I came across quite a lot of interesting case studies, which I'd invite you to look at if you're interested in this aspect of things. There's quite a lot of examples in Scotland which sets out very clearly how this has been done, the difficulties and hurdles in the process, and that made for some quite interesting reading. This onshore wind policy statement from December 2022, it also encourages innovative approaches to ensure local communities directly benefit from the affordable electricity produced on their doorstep. And this sets things out like community tariffs, community discounts. And in Scotland, there is a target in this policy to ensure 2 gigawatts of community and locally owned energy by 2030. And the policy, of course, sets out that's a minimum. It's a minimum, but that really there should be more ambition on it. So in terms of how this has concretely been working in Scotland, there was a report from December 2022, and this is still the latest document. It might be updated soon. But essentially, it's a report that looked at least from December 22, 45% progress was being made towards that 2030 goal of 2 gigawatts of community and locally owned energy by 2030 in Scotland. So looking across across the sea ever so slightly. Community ownership models are also a hot topic in Ireland. And we were having some interesting discussions over coffee before we came in about how this works in Ireland. I'm obviously from Ireland, but I'm from an area that is where wind is very much a hot topic. I'm from the Midlands of Ireland, which has depended economically since the 1940s on peat extraction. And there's a semi-state company founded back in the 1940s called Bord na Móna. And that essentially drove the whole Midlands economy. The peat was extracted from the bogs. It was burnt in local factories to produce the electricity for the region. And all of my family, going back to my grandparents, worked for this semi-state company, driving trains on the bogs, working in the electricity power station. That's all been shut down now in recent years. And that semi-state company has transitioned to what it's calling itself as a climate solutions company. And part of that is to put wind turbines on the bogs, essentially, and generate that local power. It's very controversial as well, of course, because the economy of the region where I'm from was very much driven by the peat extraction. There has been a lot of opposition to wind energy, but also a lot of searching for opportunities to drive the local economies through this new industry, essentially, and also to ensure that the local communities directly benefit. So this is something that I think is also relevant to look at it here, is to look across to Ireland as well and what's being done there. So University College Cork did a study in 2020, and that study found that over 2/3 of the people surveyed nationally who responded said they would consider investing in a local wind farm if they were given the opportunity. But in Ireland, different to what's envisaged here, wholly community-owned projects are cited as the only real option. There's less scope in Ireland for that shared ownership model with the developer. And that ownership, that study from UCC, it references Scotland and the more advanced private developer and community shared ownership model there as a more viable approach. So Ireland's also looking back to Scotland and some of the aspects we've been discussing in terms of how it might move forward in Ireland. So recently in Ireland, the Sustainable Energy Authority developed a community energy resource toolkit for onshore wind energy projects similar to the Scottish model I referred to. And there is a similar structure there, similar to that Scottish government-funded CARES organisation, which provides local communities with support, with funding, legal advice as well, in terms of how these entities can be structured. So yeah, very interesting topic, and we'll see, as I said, it's sort of separate to the planning aspects outside of the planning balance, but something there, a policy expectation to involve communities and get that community buy-in. So it'll be interesting to see how that policy is updated, and I wonder if my predictions on taking inspiration from the Scottish model will come true. So I'll pass you back to Andrew now to look forward.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. That's fascinating. It's going to be a real new aspect, I think, of how these applications are treated and dealt with. I just wanted to conclude with some final thoughts. It always amazes me when I prepare one of these talks, the night before, I always lie in bed worrying I've only got about 10 minutes material and I'll be standing here embarrassed after a quarter of an hour. And of course, now every time we're pushed for time to finish. So I'm just going to have a brief conclusion and wrap up a couple of the questions that we've had come through as we've been talking. One point just to make, I've been upbraided online for having glossed over the issue of air safety, which is a matter close to my heart. My father was a private pilot and done a lot of flying in light airplanes with him. And it is certainly true that wind farms can have a considerable effect if they're poorly located on, in particular, general aviation light aircraft flying, in terms of their disruptive influence on airflows. One point that one should perhaps consider about this is that whilst the offshore turbines can be absolutely enormous because the visual constraints are less generally with offshore wind, the size of turbines that's proposed for, or like to be proposed for onshore wind, which is tip height of 150 meters perhaps, which is still a pretty large structure, but in the context of aviation, with reasonably sensible siting, it probably is an issue that can be dealt with by proper design and location. Quite right to identify it as a real issue in certain circumstances, but it's one that's likely to be capable of being dealt with by proper location and design. Now, looking forward a little bit, is there going to be, to what extent is there going to be, one has to ask, a great rush of applications now that the ban has been lifted? Given the size of the government's ambition to double by 2030, there kind of needs to be, really. One of the significant issues, as I've said, is the relatively long lead-in time for wind farm applications. There's the issue of measuring the wind resource. Now, as I said, it's quite a considerable commercial secret as to what extent wind resource has been measured already. There may have been foresighted developers who've seen this ban eventually going away and have continued to do work to assemble data on wind resource to bring forward an application in relatively quick order. One of the issues which has arisen again in questions that we've received online is the issue of site selection. In Scotland and Wales, there are preferred areas on occasions which are designated. We haven't done such a thing in England. As I said, the percentage of local planning authorities who designated areas of search in their local plan is pretty negligible. I have to say, in my view, given where we are, given the need for applications to come forward quickly, they're likely to be done on a site-by-site basis, on a bespoke basis, rather than a process of sort of designation of areas being taken forward. I suspect that's probably too slow a process to respond to the government's urgent need. And similarly, if one looks at the national policy statement on renewable energy, which, it has to be noted, explicitly doesn't apply to onshore wind. The government was very careful to, make sure that the ban was maintained in all aspects. But EN3, which deals with renewable schemes generally, does sort of say that, well, we're not going to object to designations of preferred areas, but we don't really care if you do it or not. It's ultimately a matter for the developer, and I'm sure that's going to be the case with new onshore winds. It will come forward quickly on a site-by-site basis. The issue of grid connection, this is something of a thing that's been picked up in the media, in particular with respect to offshore wind, and it may become an issue, but because the energy produced by individual wind farms may be relatively limited in the grand scheme of things, it may not be as big an issue, but we simply just have to wait and see what happens. I've touched on the need already for gearing up for assessment. Again, that's one of the great unknowns, I suspect, as to how quickly developers, I suspect developers will be on it pretty quickly, but in particular how local planning authorities are going to be able to deal with doing the detailed assessment that they need to do. There will clearly be, one would expect, an updating of policy documents, and so some of these points may be clearer in a year or so. Again, if the government's going to achieve the sort of objective it set for itself, doubling by 2030, they're going to need to crack on with producing these updated policy documents. I bet the civil servants are working blooming hard at the moment on all the planning updates they've got to do. But in the context of wind farms in particular, as I mentioned, the noise position is still based on a fairly dated document, so one might look for some advancement there, although it did prove extremely difficult to find a proper assessment criteria for this intermittent thumping noise that one occasionally, or one gets. And I suspect there may be a clarification for onshore wind of the need position. As I said, one can draw something from the EN1 document, but that's only a sort of slightly marginal approach to assessing policy, and so one might look forward to see that. And then there's the issue of the extension of the NSIP regime. Are they going to take wind farms into the NSIP regime? Will it just be on the 50 megawatt basis, which is currently there, or will there be some other way of doing it? I mean, NSIPs, it's a very different regime. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done before the application is made, and that takes a lot of time. there is, I suspect, a suspicion that the degree of scrutiny is not quite the same or quite as direct a way as one gets at an inquiry where one's cross-examining witnesses. It tends to be a slightly more laid-back round-table feel. So we'll see whether that is going to be suitable for something as controversial as wind farms. We'll have to see what comes of it. So summing everything up, clearly there's going to be, I suspect, a big coming forward of wind. The need case is probably stronger than it was, can be expressed more virulently than it was in the previous regime. And the environmental effects are still there, need to be assessed, and I suspect there's going to be a lot of controversy about individual sites, and hopefully lots of nice inquiries and pretty places with fun going on inside. So there we are, wind, back to the future. Any questions in the room? I'll just check whether we've got any more online. You may not. You have to do the market, but we do online as well. I'm just you may not. We're expecting the provisions next week. Yep. I just wonder imagine something living in there, but I just wonder whether some local authorities might want to include in their plans going forward with their areas, or policies that support certain areas. It is possible. I suppose the difficulty is that for a local planning authority to suggest that a particular area is suitable for wind brings the controversy down on their heads, rather than the usual local council approach I found of pushing the thing away, refusing things so that they can say, well, it's only that horrible inspector from Whitehall who's brought this upon you local people, and we did everything we could. So the cynical side of me says that that may be a reason why they won't want to go down that road. The other issue I suspect is timing. I mean, from a sort of effectively a standing start, which this would be, you know, you're talking 2-3 years before you get an adopted local plan upon which any weight could be put. I mean, it may be that the government's ambition to have a more flexible way of making local development documents that we saw coming through in the Levelling Up Act, supplementary documents, as they're called, whatever they're called now, that may provide a quicker route, but I suspect that it's ultimately going to be driven by the market, by developers, and by assessment of the wind resource, because we've gone about it too much, but these micro issues of exactly where the wind blows in the right direction of the local topography to give maximum energy to the turbine is actually pretty critical, and is as much a driver of the siting as pretty much anything else. And just one last comment, it's a comment rather than a question that we've received online, just pointing out that obviously wind is intermittent, and of course it is, and one of the issues which is always going to be part of the argument about wind energy, both onshore and offshore, is what do you do to store it when the wind is blowing excessively, or there's more energy than you necessarily need. How do you store it for those times when there isn't the wind resource, which is batteries? Some people use it to pump water up to the top of the mountain for hydro energy that you can release when you need hydro energy. But it is an inevitable part of wind energy. But the wind blows quite a lot in this country, and it's a valuable and important part of our energy resource, and I suspect will become more so thanks to these changes. Well, thank you very much for your attendance, both online and in the room. I hope that's been interesting and informative, and we'll see you again at the next of these breakfast